What did you do? He's never calmed down that fast. Jonathan Pierce's voice thundered through the rose-scented air, his words laced with contempt as his towering frame advanced, eyes blazing with disbelief and something far darker. While Grace Walker, poised and unshaken, cradled his son in her arms. The same boy who moments ago had been screaming, now quiet and trusting, his face pressed gently against her chest, as if he had found the peace that eluded him in his father's mansion. The sight ignited a flicker of something foreign in Jonathan's hardened gaze. Crack in the marble facade he had spent years perfecting, but just as quickly his sneer returned, sharper and colder, as if her simple act of care was an unforgivable trespass. What kind of woman dares to stand still under the weight of a billionaire's fury, unbent and unreadable? Who is she really, and what power lies behind those calm, unwavering eyes? Stay with us to witness how one woman's quiet defiance could unravel an empire built on silence and control. The Pierce Manor stood like a crown jewel on the outskirts of Connecticut, its ivory walls gleaming under the fiery embrace of a late summer sunset. The sprawling estate, with its manicured gardens and shimmering infinity pool, was a monument to wealth. But beneath its opulent facade simmered a darkness that clung to the air like the scent of overripe roses. Inside this gilded cage, a storm was brewing, and at its heart was Grace Walker, a woman whose quiet elegance masked a fire few could fathom. Grace stepped through the towering oak doors, her black flats silent against the polished marble floor. At 30, she carried herself with a grace that seemed out of place in the starched navy uniform of a housekeeper. Her dark eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the grand foyer, crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light, a spiral staircase twisting upward like a promise of secrets. She was here on her first day, hired as a temporary housekeeper and nanny for the Pierce family, but something about her presence felt too deliberate, too precise, as if she were a chess piece placed with intent. The manor buzzed with the quiet efficiency of its staff, but an undercurrent of tension rippled through their hurried steps. Jonathan Pierce, the 45-year-old titan of a construction empire, ruled this domain with an iron fist and a heart colder than the marble beneath Grace's feet. His reputation preceded him, a man whose wealth was matched only by his disdain for those he deemed beneath him, particularly those whose skin bore a hue darker than his own. Grace had heard the whispers from the agency. Pierce was demanding, unforgiving, and quick to judge. Yet she walked into his world with her chin high, her expression a mask of calm resolve. Her first task was to tend to the nursery, where Caleb, Jonathan's 2-year-old son, awaited care. The agency had warned her about the boy's solitude. His mother, Alexandra, was often abroad, and Jonathan was too consumed by his empire to notice the child's quiet cries. Grace navigated the maze of opulent corridors, her footsteps echoing faintly, until she reached the glass doors leading to the rose garden. A soft whimper stopped her cold. There, near the edge of the shimmering pool, stood Caleb, his tiny frame dwarfed by the sprawling garden. The boy's chestnut curls were damp with tears, his sneakers caked with mud from the flower beds. He teetered dangerously close to the pool's edge, one small hand clutching a wilted rose. Grace's heart lurched. In an instant, she was moving, her body swift and silent as she crossed the lawn. She knelt before him, her voice a soothing melody cutting through the evening stillness. "Hey, little one," she murmured, her tone as warm as the fading sun. "What's got you so sad?" Caleb's wide, tear-streaked eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Grace gently scooped him into her arms, mindful of the pool's treacherous edge. His small body relaxed against her, the sobs easing as she began to hum a soulful tune, an old African-American spiritual her grandmother used to sing, "Swing low, sweet chariot, comin' for to carry me home." The notes wove through the garden, a fragile thread of comfort binding them together. Caleb's fingers curled into her uniform, his breathing steadying as he nestled closer, as if her arms were the only safe harbor he'd ever known. The moment was shattered by a voice like a whip crack. "You filthy lowlife! How dare you touch my son?" Jonathan Pierce loomed in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the glass panels like a predator poised to strike. His tailored suit did little to soften the venom in his eyes, which burned with a mix of outrage and contempt. At 6 feet, with a jaw chiseled from arrogance, he was every inch the untouchable magnate. His gaze raked over Grace, lingering on her dark skin with a disgust that needed no words. The sunset cast his shadow long and menacing across the lawn, and for a fleeting second, something flickered in his expression. Perhaps a pang of awe at the tenderness before him, but it was swiftly drowned by a sneer that twisted his features into something cruel. Grace set Caleb down with deliberate care, her movements unhurried despite the venom in Jonathan's words. She rose to her full height, meeting his glare with an intensity that seemed to catch him off guard. Her voice when she spoke was a blade sheathed in velvet. "I was comforting your son, Mr. Pierce. He was crying alone by the pool. But if you'd rather start a war over it, choose your enemies wisely." The air crackled with unspoken challenges. Jonathan's fist clenched, his face flushing with the audacity of her response. For a man accustomed to deference, her defiance was a slap he hadn't anticipated. Caleb whimpered, reaching for Grace's hand, but Jonathan stormed forward, scooping the boy into his arms with a roughness that made the child flinch. "Get back to work," he snarled, "and stay away from my son. People like you don't belong here." Grace held his gaze a moment longer, her eyes a storm of secrets, then turned and walked back toward the manor, her posture unbroken. The insult hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown, but she moved as if it were nothing more than dust to be brushed away. Inside, her mind was already racing, cataloging every detail of the encounter. The venom in his tone, the fear in Caleb's eyes, the weight of a household ruled by a man who saw her as less than human. As she re-entered the foyer, a young man in a delivery uniform caught her eye. Eddie, the agency had called him, a lanky American with a quick smile and a penchant for chatter. He was unloading a crate of wine, his hazel eyes darting nervously toward the garden, where Jonathan's voice still echoed. "Rough first day, huh?" he said, keeping his voice low. "Pierce is intense. Watch yourself, Grace. He's got eyes everywhere." She offered a faint smile, her expression unreadable. "Thanks, Eddie. I can handle intense." Eddie hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just be careful. I've seen some weird stuff around here. Packages coming in at midnight, guys in suits who don't talk. Pierce isn't just a jerk. He's got secrets." Grace nodded, filing the information away like a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. She moved toward the nursery, her steps measured, but her mind was a whirlwind. The manor was more than a house. It was a fortress of lies, and Jonathan Pierce was its king. But kings could fall, and Grace Walker, though he saw her as nothing, was no ordinary pawn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the manor into twilight, a single rose petal drifted into the pool, rippling the water's surface. The storm was coming, and Grace was its harbinger, her quiet strength a promise of reckoning yet to come. The air in the manor thrummed with a deceptive calm, like the hush before a storm breaks. Grace Walker moved through the opulent dining hall, her hands deftly polishing a silver candelabra, each stroke deliberate, masking the pulse of defiance that simmered beneath her composed exterior. The memory of Jonathan Pierce's venomous words, "You filthy lowlife," still burned, but Grace's face betrayed nothing. She was a woman accustomed to navigating hostility, her dark eyes sharp as they flickered toward the arched doorway, anticipating the next move in this dangerous game. Jonathan's presence announced itself before he appeared, the sharp click of his polished loafers echoing like a metronome of power. He entered the hall, his tailored blazer a stark contrast to the predatory glint in his eyes. Gone was the raw fury of their garden encounter. In its place was a calculated charm, a mask so polished it might have fooled a less discerning soul. He paused, leaning casually against a mahogany table, his gaze lingering on Grace with an intensity that felt like a blade grazing skin. "You're good with silver, Grace," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon, laced with a patronizing warmth. "Almost makes me forget you're just the help." The word help dripped with condescension, a reminder of the chasm he perceived between them. Grace set the candelabra down, her movements unhurried, her expression a serene wall. "I take pride in my work, Mr. Pierce," she replied, her tone even, but her eyes held a spark that dared him to push further. He smiled, a predator baring teeth. Good. I like that. Maybe you're not as useless as I thought. He stepped closer, his cologne, a sharp blend of cedar and arrogance, invading her space. I've been thinking, you're wasted on scrubbing floors. A woman like you, with certain qualities, could do better here. Grace's fingers tightened briefly around the polishing cloth, but her face remained impassive. I'm content where I am, sir, she said, her voice a careful balance of deference and steel. Jonathan's smile widened, as if her refusal were a game he relished. He gestured toward a tray of crystal flutes awaiting her attention. Light work for you today. I'll have you set the table for dinner. Join me afterward, just the two of us. His eyes roamed over her, a blatant appraisal that made her skin crawl. You're too pretty for that uniform, Grace. Stay here. Be special to me, and you'll never touch a rag again. The words hung in the air, a vile proposition wrapped in silk. Grace's stomach churned, not from fear but from the audacity of his assumption. That her dignity could be bought, that her worth was his to define. She straightened, meeting his gaze with a calm that belied the fire within. I'd rather scrub floors for a lifetime than sell my soul for your favors, Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice low, each word a precise cut. My worth isn't yours to barter. For a moment, Jonathan's facade cracked, his eyes narrowing to slits. The air thickened with his barely restrained rage, but he masked it with a chuckle, cold and hollow. You'll regret that, he said, his tone a promise of retribution. He turned on his heel, but not before issuing a command over his shoulder. Mrs. Hawthorne will have new orders for you. Don't test me again. The dining hall fell silent, save for the faint clink of crystal as Grace resumed her work. But her mind was a storm, calculating the weight of Jonathan's words, the danger of his wounded pride. She knew men like him, kings of their domains, who saw rejection as a declaration of war, and war, she sensed, was exactly what he intended. By midday, the manor's staff had transformed into an extension of Jonathan's wrath. Mrs. Hawthorne, the gaunt housekeeper, with a face like weathered stone, delivered the new orders with a sneer. Mr. Pierce says you're to clean the wine cellar, alone, and no meals until it's spotless. Her eyes gleamed with malice as she added, You should be grateful to even breathe this air, girl. Grace nodded, her expression unreadable, but the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed the sting of the insult. The wine cellar was a cavernous labyrinth, its stone floors slick with damp, its air heavy with the musty scent of oak barrels. It was a task meant to break her, to grind her resolve into dust. As she descended the narrow stairs, the chill seeped into her bones, but her spirit remained unbowed. She worked in silence, her hands steady, her thoughts sharp as she cataloged every slight, every calculated cruelty. Upstairs, the staff moved like puppets on Jonathan's strings. In the kitchen, Miguel, the Cuban-American chef with soulful eyes and a weary slump, prepared the day's meals under Mrs. Hawthorne's watchful gaze. When Grace emerged briefly to fetch cleaning supplies, he caught her eye, his hands hesitating over a tray of roasted vegetables. They're starving you out, he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. I have to follow orders, Grace, but this ain't right. Grace offered a faint smile, her gaze steady. I've faced worse, Miguel. Keep your head down. I'll be fine. Her words were a lifeline, a quiet assurance that she was not as fragile as they assumed. Miguel nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, a flicker of admiration breaking through his fear. The other staff were less kind. A young maid, her face pinched with obedience, turned away when Grace passed. A groundskeeper muttered under his breath, his words too low to catch but heavy with disdain. Jonathan's influence was a poison, seeping into every corner, turning colleagues into enforcers of his will. Yet Grace moved through their scorn like a ship cutting through fog, her dignity a shield no insult could pierce. As evening fell, the dining hall glowed with the promise of a private dinner Jonathan had planned. Grace was summoned to set the table, her hands arranging fine china under Mrs. Hawthorne's critical eye. The older woman's voice was a hiss. Don't think you're clever, refusing Mr. Pierce. You're nothing here. Nothing. Grace placed a fork with precision, her voice soft but unyielding. I'm enough for myself, Mrs. Hawthorne. That's more than some can say. The words landed like a slap, and Mrs. Hawthorne's face twisted, but she said nothing, retreating to the shadows. Along with the gleaming table, Grace paused, her fingers brushing the edge of a wine glass. The manor was a battlefield now, and Jonathan had drawn the lines. His false kindness had been a trap, his proposition a test she'd refused to fail. But refusal came at a cost, and she felt its weight in the hunger gnawing at her stomach, the ache in her arms from hours in the cellar. Yet she stood taller, her resolve a flame that burned brighter in the face of his cruelty. The distant sound of Jonathan's laughter echoed from another room, a reminder of his untouchable power. But Grace's eyes gleamed with a secret strength, a promise that this was only the beginning. She was no pawn in his game. She was a player, and the board was about to shift. The manor hummed with a sinister quiet, its grandeur now a prison where every glance was a blade and every whisper a chain. Grace Walker moved through this hostile terrain like a shadow, her navy uniform a stark contrast to the fire that burned within her. The weight of Jonathan Pierce's retribution pressed against her, his vile proposition rejected, his false kindness replaced by a calculated campaign to break her spirit. Yet Grace's resolve was a fortress, unyielding even as hunger gnawed at her core and exhaustion tugged at her limbs. She was a woman forged in adversity, and this was merely another battlefield. The wine cellar had been her punishment, a dank labyrinth of stone and shadow where she'd toiled for hours, scrubbing floors slick with mildew under Mrs. Hawthorne's merciless orders. Now relegated to the scullery, Grace stood over a sink piled high with greasy pans, the acrid scent of burnt oil stinging her nose. The task was another deliberate slight, a message from Jonathan that her defiance would cost her dearly. The other staff, once merely indifferent, had become enforcers of his will, their eyes averted, their voices hushed when she passed. Isolation was his weapon, but Grace wielded solitude like a shield, her mind sharp and vigilant. She plunged her hands into the scalding water, the heat a fleeting distraction from the ache in her stomach. Meals had been withheld since yesterday, a cruel edict cloaked in Mrs. Hawthorne's sneering justification. "Mr. Pierce says you haven't earned it." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, but she worked in silence, her movements precise, each scrub a defiance of their attempts to diminish her. Her thoughts, however, were far from the sink. They were on Jonathan, his smug laughter, his predatory gaze, and the puzzle he represented. There was something beneath his cruelty, a secret festering in the manor's opulent halls, and Grace was determined to uncover it. Her chance came unexpectedly, a fleeting window in the day's relentless grind. Tasked with retrieving cleaning supplies from the storage closet near the study, Grace found herself alone in a corridor lined with gilded portraits. The faint murmur of Jonathan's voice drifted through the heavy oak door of his private office, a low, urgent cadence that pricked her senses. She paused, her hand hovering over a bottle of polish, her ears straining to catch the words. "The shipment arrives at midnight. No delays. The containers are clean, but we can't risk exposure." The words were clipped, coded, but they carried a weight that sent a shiver down her spine. Grace's pulse quickened, but her face remained a mask of calm. She edged closer, her movements silent as a whisper, and pressed her ear against the door's cool surface. Jonathan's voice grew sharper. "Tell them to stick to the schedule. Any slip, and we're all finished." A pause, then a colder tone. "And keep an eye on that new girl. She's too observant." The words were a dart aimed at her, but Grace's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Observant, indeed. She slipped a small pen from her pocket, a seemingly innocuous tool, but its hidden camera was a silent ally. With a practiced flick, she wedged it into the gap between a portrait frame and the wall, its lens angled toward the study door. The device was a gamble, a whisper of rebellion against the manor's suffocating control. But Grace was no stranger to calculated risks. She stepped back, her heart a steady drumbeat, and resumed her task, the bottle of polish now a prop in her careful disguise. The corridor was no longer empty when she turned. Mrs. Hawthorne stood at the far end, her gaunt frame a specter in the dim light, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's taking you so long?" she snapped, her voice a lash. "Dawdling won't win you any favors here." Grace met her gaze, her expression serene but unyielding. "Just making sure I have everything, ma'am," she replied, her tone a perfect blend of deference and defiance. Mrs. Hawthorne's lips pursed, but she said nothing, her silence a grudging retreat. Grace walked past, her head high, the weight of the pen's secret a quiet triumph in her pocket. Back in the scullery, the isolation deepened. The staff's taint was palpable now. A maid who once nodded in passing now turned her back. A butler who muttered slurs under his breath. Grace felt their rejection like a cold wind, but it only sharpened her focus. She was alone, but solitude was her domain, a space where she could observe, plan, and wait she did, her eyes catching every detail. The locked drawer in the pantry, the coated ledger left carelessly on a counter, the nervous glances of a footman who lingered too long near the back entrance. Her only flicker of connection came from an unexpected source. Miguel, the chef with soulful eyes and a burdened heart, appeared at the scullery door, his hands clutching a tray of soiled linens as a pretext. His gaze darted nervously, but his voice was low, urgent. "They're watching you, Grace," he whispered. "Hawthorne's got everyone reporting your every move. It's not right, but I got a family to feed." Grace paused, her hand still in the sudsy water, and met his eyes. "I know, Miguel," she said softly, her voice a lifeline in the storm. "You're caught in his web, same as them. But webs can break." Her words were gentle but weighted, a promise that she saw his struggle and judged him not for it. Miguel's shoulders sagged, a mix of guilt and gratitude flickering across his face. He hesitated, then slid a small roll wrapped in cloth across the counter. "It's not much," he muttered. "Just don't let them see." She unwrapped it later, alone in the dim light of the scullery. A single biscuit, still warm, its edges crumbling like the last vestige of kindness in this place. Grace held it, the gesture piercing the armor she'd built around her heart. She didn't eat it, not yet. Instead, she tucked it into her pocket, a talisman against the manor's cruelty, a reminder that even in darkness, there were cracks where light could seep through. The day wore on, each hour a test of endurance. Grace's body ached, her stomach a hollow ache, but her mind was a blade, honed by every slight, every whispered insult. She caught fragments of the manor's underbelly, a cryptic note discarded in the trash, a phone call abruptly ended when she entered her room. Jonathan's warning echoed in her thoughts. "She's too observant. Let him think so," she mused. Let him fear the eyes he could not control. As twilight bled through the windows, Grace stood alone in the scullery, the last pan gleaming under her touch. The manor's silence was oppressive, a living thing that pressed against her. But she was not broken. She was a sentinel, watching, waiting, her solitude a crucible where her strength was forged anew. Jonathan thought he could crush her, but he had underestimated the woman he scorned. And in that miscalculation, Grace found her power, a quiet promise that his empire of lies would soon face a reckoning. The manor thrummed with a treacherous pulse, its air thick with the weight of unspoken plots. Grace Walker moved through this gilded cage like a phantom, her navy uniform a thin veil over the steel of her resolve. Days of starvation, tainting, and grueling tasks had forged her defiance into something unbreakable, a blade sharpened by Jonathan Pierce's relentless cruelty. His campaign to crush her had only deepened her vigilance, and now, as the household buzzed with preparations for a grand charity gala, Grace sensed a storm gathering, one that would test her like never before. The gala was Jonathan's stage, a spectacle to flaunt his wealth and cement his untouchable status. Grace's role was menial, polishing crystal flutes, arranging floral centerpieces, her hands moving with mechanical precision under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Hawthorne. The housekeeper's presence was a constant shadow, her voice a venomous drip. "Faster," she snapped, her gaunt face twisted with disdain. "You're lucky to even touch these. Don't think your tricks fool anyone." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, but she offered no retort, her eyes flickering with a quiet fire. She knew the game. Every slight was a thread in Jonathan's web, designed to trap her. Mid-morning, a commotion erupted in the upper halls. Grace was summoned to the master suite, a rare breach of her usual duties. Mrs. Hawthorne led the way, her stride brisk, her silence ominous. The suite's heavy doors swung open, revealing Jonathan standing by an ornate vanity, his face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him was a velvet box, its lid flung wide, empty of the treasure it was meant to hold. An $80,000 diamond necklace, a glittering symbol of devotion to his absent wife Alexandra. The room crackled with accusation, and Grace's pulse quickened, sensing the trap closing around her. "Where is it?" Jonathan's voice was a low growl, each word a dagger aimed at her. His eyes, cold as winter steel, bored into her, daring her to flinch. "Don't play dumb. You were in here this morning, weren't you?" Grace stood tall, her hands clasped before her, her expression a serene fortress. "I haven't been in this room, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice steady, a calm that seemed to infuriate him further. "I've been in the dining hall all day, as Mrs. Hawthorne can confirm." The housekeeper's lips curled into a sneer. "Lies," she hissed, stepping forward with a predatory gleam. "I saw you skulking near the suite earlier, and look what I found." From her apron she produced another velvet box, empty, its lining frayed, as if hastily discarded. "This was in your locker, tucked behind your things. Care to explain?" The accusation landed like a thunderclap, the room's air growing heavy with the weight of their conspiracy. Grace's heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing, her mind racing to piece together the setup. The necklace's absence, the planted box, the convenient timing. It was a meticulously crafted frame, Jonathan's revenge for her defiance. She glanced at him, catching the flicker of triumph in his eyes, a predator certain of his kill. "You think you can steal from me?" Jonathan advanced, his voice rising to a snarl. "You, a nobody, a lowlife who doesn't belong in my house? I've called the police. They'll tear your life apart, and you'll beg for mercy when they're done." His words were a barrage, each one laced with the venom of his prejudice, meant to crush her spirit before the law could touch her. Grace's gaze held his, unyielding, a storm brewing behind her calm. "I didn't take your necklace, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice a blade sheathed in silk. "And I don't beg. If you want to call the police, do it. The truth doesn't bend to threats." Her defiance was a spark in the tinder of his rage, and for a moment his composure faltered, his fist clenching as if to strike. Mrs. Hawthorne seized the moment, her voice a triumphant crow. "The cameras were off for 10 minutes this morning. Maintenance, they said. Just enough time for you to slip in and out. Convenient, isn't it?" The lie was blatant, a stitch in their tapestry of deceit. But Grace's mind latched onto a detail. The cameras. If they were truly off, it was by design. And someone, likely Jonathan's assistant, Blake, had orchestrated it. Before Grace could respond, a small figure appeared at the door. Caleb, unnoticed by the adults, toddled into the room, his plastic shovel clutched tightly. His wide eyes fixed on Grace, and he reached for her, his voice a plaintive chirp. "Grace!" The sound pierced the tension, a reminder of the bond Jonathan loathed. Grace knelt, gently guiding the boy back toward the door, her touch a shield against the room's hostility. "Get him out of here!" Jonathan snapped, his voice a whip. But Caleb's presence had shifted something, a crack in the facade of their accusation. Grace rose, her eyes locking with Jonathan's, and for a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of unease. Perhaps the realization that her composure was a weapon he couldn't predict. The standoff was interrupted by the distant wail of sirens. The police were approaching, their arrival a ticking clock. Mrs. Hawthorne's smile was a serpent's, but Grace's expression remained serene, her mind a whirlwind of strategy. She had seen the coded receipt, heard Jonathan's cryptic calls, and now this. A frame so blatant it reeked of desperation. The necklace was a pawn in a larger game, and she was no longer just defending herself. She was playing to win. As the police entered, their boots heavy against the marble floor, Jonathan stepped forward, his voice a polished lie. "This woman stole an $80,000 necklace," he declared, gesturing to the empty box. "She's been in trouble since she arrived. I want her arrested." The officers, two stern-faced men, turned their gazes to Grace, their hands resting on their belts. Grace met their eyes, her posture unbowed. "I'm innocent," she said, her voice clear, a beacon in the storm. And I welcome your investigation. Search my things, check the records. You'll find nothing because I took nothing. Her words were a challenge, not just to Jonathan, but to the system that had failed so many like her. The officers exchanged a glance, sensing the weight of her conviction. Mrs. Hawthorne scoffed, but Jonathan's triumph wavered, his eyes darting to the empty box as if it might betray him. Grace's calm was a mirror, reflecting his uncertainty back at him. She had no proof, yet, but her defiance was a seed, planted deep in the cracks of his empire. The police motioned for her to follow, but Grace moved with dignity, her head high, her heart a drumbeat of resistance. As she passed Caleb, the boy reached out, his tiny hand brushing hers. Grace offered a faint smile, a promise to return. The manor's walls seemed to close in, but she walked through them like a warrior, her spirit aflame no accusation could extinguish. Jonathan thought he had cornered her, but he had only fanned the embers of her rebellion, and those embers were poised to ignite. The manor's air was a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of a lie about to snap. Grace Walker stood in the master suite, a lone figure in her Navy uniform, surrounded by the venomous gazes of her accusers. Jonathan Pierce loomed before her, his face a mask of righteous fury, the empty velvet box in his hand a prop in his cruel charade. The police officers, their hands poised near their belts, watched with skeptical eyes while Mrs. Hawthorne's sneer was a serpent's triumph. The siren's wail had faded, but the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each heartbeat. Grace's calm was a beacon in this storm, her defiance a flame that refused to be snuffed out, even as the noose of Jonathan's accusation tightened. "You're finished," Jonathan snarled, his voice a blade aimed at her heart. "This necklace, $80,000, a gift from my wife, was in your hands, and now it's gone. You thought you could slink away with it, didn't you, you thieving lowlife?" His words dripped with prejudice, each syllable a lash meant to strip her of dignity. The officers shifted, one scribbling notes, the other's gaze narrowing as Jonathan gestured to the empty box Mrs. Hawthorne had found in Grace's locker. Grace's eyes met his, unyielding, a storm of resolve behind her serene facade. "I didn't steal your necklace, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his venom like a bell in the fog. "And I'm not the one who should be afraid of the truth." Her words were a gauntlet, thrown with a precision that made Jonathan's triumph falter, his jaw tightening as if sensing a shift in the game he thought he'd won. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward, her voice a crow's caw. "She's lying. The cameras were off for 10 minutes this morning, just enough time for her to sneak in here. We found the box and her things. What more proof do you need?" The lie was a well-rehearsed stitch in their tapestry of deceit, but Grace's mind was a razor, slicing through their falsehoods. She had anticipated this moment, her every action a thread in a counterplot they couldn't imagine. "Officers," Grace said, turning to the police with a calm that bordered on commanding, "I request 5 minutes to present my side. If I'm wrong, I'll go willingly. But if I'm right, you'll want to hear this." Her voice carried an authority that made the officers pause, exchanging a glance. The younger one, his badge glinting under the chandelier's light, nodded. 5 minutes, he said, his tone wary but curious. Jonathan's laugh was a bark of disbelief. "You're stalling," he sneered. "What could a nobody like you possibly have to say?" But his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, a crack in his armor that Grace saw and seized. She reached into her pocket, producing a small device, a pen, innocuous to the untrained eye. But its hidden camera had been her silent ally. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "recorded the truth." She connected it to her phone, her movements deliberate, as the room's air grew thick with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, projecting a grainy but unmistakable image. Blake Sanders, Jonathan's assistant, slipping into the master suite that morning, his gloved hands lifting the velvet box from the vanity. The audio crackled, capturing Blake's muttered words. "Make sure she takes the fall, per Mr. Pierce's orders." The footage showed him stashing the box in a hidden safe on Jonathan's yacht, its GPS signal pulsing like a heartbeat. The room erupted in stunned silence, broken only by Mrs. Hawthorne's gasp, her hand clutching her throat. Jonathan's face drained of color, his fists clenching as the truth flayed his carefully crafted lie. "That's fabricated," he roared, lunging toward Grace. But the older officer stepped between them, his hand raised in warning. "There's more," Grace said, her voice a quiet thunder. She produced a folded paper from her apron, a receipt for container delivery, midnight, Dock 7. Its cryptic numbers a damning clue. "This links to transactions through a Cayman account, tied to a network smuggling people in your construction containers, Mr. Pierce." Her words were a scalpel, precise and devastating, and for the first time, she let the mask slip, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath the housekeeper's guise. "I am not just a housekeeper," she declared, her eyes blazing with righteous fire. "I am Lieutenant Grace Walker, FBI, and I've been investigating your operation for months." The revelation landed like a grenade, shattering the room's fragile equilibrium. The officers' hands moved to their radios, their faces hardening as the weight of her words sank in. Mrs. Hawthorne staggered, her sneer replaced by a dawning horror, while Jonathan's rage morphed into panic, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "You can't prove any of this," he shouted, his voice cracking, but the desperation in his eyes betrayed him. Grace's phone buzzed, a secure line connecting to her contact, a voice crackling through, calm and authoritative. "Lieutenant Walker, this is Agent Carter. We've got the yacht's GPS locked and the Cayman accounts traced. The strike team is en route. ETA 3 minutes." The manor's doors burst open, and FBI agents in dark vests flooded the suite, their commands sharp and unyielding. "Jonathan Pierce, you're under arrest for money laundering, tax evasion, human trafficking, and attempted framing of an innocent woman," the lead agent barked, snapping cuffs onto Jonathan's wrists. He struggled, his face a mask of disbelief, his empire crumbling in the span of moments. "You'll pay for this," he spat at Grace, his voice a hollow echo of the power he'd once wielded. Grace met his gaze, her expression a blend of pity and resolve. "You paid the price when you thought you could break me," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "The truth doesn't kneel to men like you." Her words were a final verdict, delivered with the weight of justice long denied. As the agents led Jonathan away, his shouts fading into the distance, Caleb toddled into the room, unnoticed in the chaos. His wide eyes sought Grace, and she knelt, offering a gentle smile. "You're safe, little man," she whispered, her hand brushing his curls. The boy's presence was a quiet anchor, a reminder of why she'd endured this crucible. Mrs. Hawthorne collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling, her complicity exposed. The officers turned to her, their questions sharp, but Grace's focus was elsewhere. She glanced at her phone, where a message from her sister Lisa glowed. "You did it, Gracie. Proud of you." The words were a balm, a reminder of the life beyond this manor's lies. The FBI agents moved with precision, securing the scene, their radios crackling with updates. Grace stood apart, her uniform a relic of the role she'd played so flawlessly. She was no longer the housekeeper, the scapegoat, the lowlife Jonathan had scorned. She was a force, a beacon of truth that had shattered his empire. The manor's walls seemed to exhale, as if relieved of a poison that had festered too long. As the agents escorted her to debrief, Grace walked with her head high, her steps a quiet triumph. Jonathan's screams echoed faintly, a fading chorus of his undoing. The truth had been her weapon, and she had wielded it with precision, turning his trap into his tomb. The battle was won, but Grace knew the war was far from over. For now, though, she savored the victory, a seed of justice planted in the ashes of his lies. The manor stood as a hollow monument to a fallen king, its grandeur stripped bare by the truth that had erupted within its walls. Grace Walker, no longer a housekeeper, but Lieutenant Grace Walker of the FBI, stood at the epicenter of this reckoning, her Navy uniform a relic of the role she'd shed like a chrysalis. The air was electric with the aftermath of Jonathan Pierce's arrest, his empire of lies crumbling under the weight of her revelations. Handcuffs gleamed on his wrists, a stark contrast to the tailored suit that once cloaked his untouchable arrogance. Yet the storm was far from over. The manor's inhabitants, complicit or coerced, now faced the mirror of their own choices, and Grace was the unyielding light forcing them to look. Jonathan's voice echoed through the master suite, a desperate roar that ricocheted off the gilded walls. "You'll regret this," he bellowed, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief, as FBI agents dragged him toward the door. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, locked onto Grace, burning with a hatred that could have scorched the earth. "You're nothing but a liar, a nobody who tricked her way in here." The words were a final lash, a futile attempt to reclaim the power she'd stripped from him with her pen camera, her damning receipt, her unshakable truth. Grace met his gaze, her expression a blend of steel and sorrow. "You built your cage, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice a quiet thunder that silenced his tirade. "You thought you could break me, but all you broke was yourself." Her words were a verdict, delivered with the weight of justice, and Jonathan's struggle faltered, his shoulders sagging as the reality of his defeat sank in. The agents pulled him away, his shouts fading into a hollow wail, a king dethroned by the woman he'd scorned. The suite was a tableau of shattered illusions. Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper whose malice had fueled Jonathan's trap, collapsed into a velvet chair, her gaunt face crumbling like ash. Her hands trembled, clutching the apron that had hidden her complicity. The empty velvet box she'd planted in Grace's locker, a sin now laid bare. "I had no choice," she whispered, her voice a broken thread. He promised me a pension, a future. I didn't mean—" Her words trailed off, drowned by the sobs that racked her frame, a confession too late to undo the damage. Grace turned to her, her eyes softening but unyielding. "You chose to hurt an innocent woman," she said, her tone firm but not cruel. "Own that choice, Mrs. Hawthorne. It's the only way to start again." The words were a lifeline, a call to accountability that pierced the housekeeper's despair. Mrs. Hawthorne's tears fell harder, but she nodded, a flicker of resolve breaking through her shame. The room's tension shifted as a new presence entered. Alexandra, Jonathan's wife, swept in, her silk scarf fluttering like a flag of surrender. Her face, usually a mask of poised elegance, was etched with exhaustion and resolve. She had arrived from Europe mere hours ago, summoned by the scandal that now engulfed her husband. Her eyes found Grace, and for a moment the two women stood as equals, bound by the wreckage of Jonathan's lies. "I knew he was flawed," Alexandra said, her voice low, trembling with a truth she'd long buried. "The late-night calls, the secrecy, I suspected, but I was too afraid to face it. You, you freed us, Grace. Me, Caleb, this whole broken family." She stepped closer, producing a small silver bracelet engraved with Caleb's name, and pressed it into Grace's hand. "This is from me, not him. Thank you for saving my son from his father's poison." Grace's fingers closed around the bracelet, her heart stirred by the gesture. "I did what was right," she said simply, her voice a quiet anchor. "Caleb deserves better than lies." Alexandra's eyes glistened, and she nodded, a silent pact forged in the ashes of her marriage. The manor's staff, once Jonathan's puppets, now hovered at the edges, their faces a mosaic of guilt and awe. Miguel, the chef whose small acts of kindness had been Grace's lifeline, pushed through the crowd, his eyes brimming with remorse. "I'm sorry, Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I followed his orders, kept quiet when I shouldn't have, but I told the agents everything. Those midnight deliveries, the men in suits. I should have stood up sooner." Grace placed a hand on his arm, her touch a bridge across their shared struggle. "You stood up when it mattered, Miguel," she said, her smile a beacon of forgiveness. "That's enough." Her words lifted a weight from his shoulders, and he exhaled, a man reclaimed by his courage. The FBI agents moved with clinical precision, securing evidence and questioning witnesses, their radios crackling with urgency. Grace stood apart, her role as investigator now clear, but her thoughts lingered on Caleb. The boy had wandered back into the suite, his plastic shovel clutched tightly, his wide eyes searching for her. She knelt before him, her voice a gentle melody. "You're okay, little man," she whispered, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'll come back to see you, I promise." Caleb's tiny hand gripped hers, a trust unbroken by the chaos around them. As Grace rose, an agent approached, his voice low. "Lieutenant, we need you for the debrief. The yacht's secured and Blake's in custody. He's talking, implicating Pierce in everything." Grace nodded, her mind already shifting to the next steps, but her heart held fast to the boy at her side. She guided Caleb to Alexandra, who scooped him into her arms, her face softening with a love she'd long neglected. The suite emptied, the agents escorting Mrs. Hawthorne for questioning, the staff dispersing like shadows fleeing the light. Grace lingered a moment, her gaze sweeping the room where Jonathan's empire had fallen. The empty velvet box lay discarded on the vanity, a relic of his failed trap. She picked it up, turning it in her hands, a symbol of the lies she'd dismantled. Her phone buzzed, a message from her sister Lisa. "You're unstoppable, Gracie. The world's watching." The words were a spark, igniting a quiet pride in her chest. Alexandra approached once more, her voice a whisper. "I'm filing for divorce," she said, her eyes resolute. "Caleb's trust fund is secure, and I'll make sure he grows up knowing what you did for us." She hesitated, then added, "You're more than a hero, Grace. You're a mirror, showing us who we are." Grace offered a faint smile, the bracelet's weight a reminder of her impact. "Then keep looking in that mirror," she said, "for Caleb's sake." Alexandra nodded, a vow sealed in the silence between them. As Grace walked toward the waiting agents, her steps were steady, her spirit a flame that had burned through Jonathan's darkness. His downfall was complete, his screams now a distant echo, but the awakening of those around him, Miguel's courage, Mrs. Hawthorne's remorse, Alexandra's resolve, was Grace's true victory. She had toppled a tyrant, not with force but with truth, and in doing so, she had planted seeds of change in a house once ruled by lies. The manor's shadow had faded, its once oppressive weight now a distant echo in the wake of Jonathan Pierce's downfall. 6 months had passed since Grace Walker, revealed as Lieutenant Grace Walker of the FBI, dismantled his empire of lies with a pen camera and an unyielding spirit. The air of that gilded cage no longer choked her. Instead, she stood as a beacon, her triumph a spark that ignited change far beyond its walls. Now in the heart of a new battle, Grace carried the torch of justice, her resolve a flame that burned brighter in the face of a world still riddled with inequity. Washington, D.C. pulsed with the gravity of power as Grace stepped into the congressional hearing room, her navy suit a sharp contrast to the housekeeper's uniform she'd once worn. The chamber buzzed with murmurs, senators and aides leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the woman whose story had shaken the nation. Grace took her place at the witness table, her hands steady, her gaze a quiet storm. The gavel fell, and the room hushed, the weight of her testimony a palpable force. "Lieutenant Walker," the committee chair began, his voice resonant, "your investigation exposed not only criminal enterprises, but systemic injustices against domestic workers. Please share your proposal for the Walker Act." Grace leaned into the microphone, her voice clear and commanding, a melody of conviction that silenced even the skeptics. In 2024, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that 68% of domestic workers in America are women of color. Yet 82% of their discrimination complaints go unresolved, she said, her words a scalpel cutting through apathy. These workers, housekeepers, nannies, cooks, are the backbone of our homes, yet they face exploitation, false accusations, and abuse without recourse. The Walker Act demands mandatory surveillance in high-income households, health insurance for domestic workers, and severe penalties for framing or harassing them. This isn't just policy, it's a promise to those who've been silenced too long. Her words rippled through the chamber, met with nods from some senators, furrowed brows from others. A female senator, her glasses glinting, leaned forward. "Your own experience, Lieutenant, framed for theft, shows the urgency. How do we ensure enforcement?" Grace's eyes met hers, a spark of shared understanding. "Transparency," she replied. "Independent oversight boards funded by fines from violators will monitor compliance. No one should fear losing their livelihood for standing up." The room erupted in applause, a tide of support that lifted her heart, a testament to the lives her fight would touch. As Grace left the chamber, her phone buzzed with a message from her sister Lisa. "You're changing the world, Gracie." She smiled, a quiet pride warming her chest. But her thoughts turned to those who'd walked this path with her, their courage a thread in the tapestry of her victory. Days later, Grace found herself in a bustling corner of a city, drawn by an invitation she couldn't refuse. Miguel, the chef whose whispered kindness had sustained her through the manor's darkest days, stood before a modest storefront, its sign gleaming. Sabor Latino. The aroma of roasted spices wafted through the air, a celebration of his heritage and newfound freedom. A crowd gathered for the grand opening, their chatter a vibrant hum, but Miguel's eyes sought Grace, his face breaking into a grin as she approached. "You came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Pulled her into a warm embrace, his chef's apron dusted with flour. "This place, it's because of you, Grace. You showed me what courage looks like." He led her inside where a small alcove caught her breath. Dubbed Grace's Corner, it was adorned with roses and a plaque. "For the woman who taught me to stand for what's right." Grace's throat tightened, her fingers tracing the words, a legacy etched in more than stone. "You're giving me too much credit," she said, her smile soft but radiant. "You found your strength, Miguel. This is yours." He shook his head, his eyes glistening. "You broke the chains, Grace. I'm just cooking the feast." The crowd cheered as he cut the ribbon, and Grace clapped, her heart swelling with the joy of his redemption. The week brought another encounter, one laced with quiet gratitude. Alexandra, Jonathan's now estranged wife, had requested a meeting at a discreet cafe, her silk scarf a shield against the world's prying eyes. She sat across from Grace, her face a map of hard-won clarity. "I knew Jonathan was rotten," she confessed, her voice a fragile thread. "The lies, the cruelty, I suspected, but I was too weak to act. You saved Caleb and me, Grace, from a life built on his poison." Her hand trembled as she slid a silver bracelet across the table, Caleb's name engraved in delicate script. "This is my thanks, not his." Grace accepted the bracelet, its weight a reminder of the boy she'd protected. "You're free now," she said gently. "Build a life for Caleb that shines." Alexandra's eyes glistened, a nod sealing their unspoken bond. As she left, Grace felt a weight lift, a chapter closed with grace and forgiveness. Her final act of this chapter was the most tender. On a sun-drenched afternoon, Grace drove to a community pool, where Caleb, now a bright-eyed 3-year-old, splashed in the shallow end. Alexandra had invited her to teach him to swim, a gesture of trust that warmed Grace's soul. She knelt by the water, her laughter mingling with Caleb's giggles as she guided his small arms through the strokes. "Kick hard, little man," she encouraged, her voice a melody of care. Caleb beamed, his face alight with pride. "Grace, I want to be strong like you," he chirped, his words a spark that ignited her heart. "You're already strong," she replied, ruffling his curls. The pool's ripples caught the sunlight, a symbol of healing, of new beginnings. As Caleb paddled, Grace's thoughts drifted to Jonathan, now a ghost in a cell, his letter arriving days ago. Seeing the truth was a gift, not a curse. She'd folded it away, her focus on the future, on the lives she'd touched. That evening, Grace sat alone, her phone glowing with news. Walker Act gains 94% Senate support. The headline was a crown, but her true reward was the bracelet on her wrist, Miguel's plaque, Caleb's laughter. She spoke softly as if to the world. When a woman scorned rises, she doesn't just save herself, she opens doors for the silenced. Her words were a vow, a legacy that would outshine any manor's lies, a light of justice that would never dim. As the echoes of Grace Walker's triumph fade, her story lingers, a testament to the power of truth over tyranny, of courage over cruelty. Her journey from scorned housekeeper to beacon of justice challenges us all. What battles have you fought against prejudice, and how have you risen above? Share your thoughts, your stories, in the comments below. Let's inspire each other to stand tall. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable ride, for lending your hearts to Grace's fight. Until we meet again, keep seeking the light of justice, and may your own stories shine just as bright. Farewell for now.